Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to go through this work with you. And so over the last 15 years, I've been thinking a lot about habitat. What are the things that are important in my environment and our environment that go towards making up my well-being, our well-being? And it really came home when I saw a really interesting exercise. Somebody had laid out old maps of Edinburgh and given everybody pencils and said, draw on the map where you used to play as a kid. And then they brought an overlay of modern maps. And it was interesting to see how many of those spaces had disappeared. And I've been thinking about what the difference is between the environment and habitat. So habitat, everything that goes towards making that word up, contributes in some way towards our health, our well-being, and happiness. And I see happiness and feelings increasingly important. It's a type of knowledge. It's a type of knowledge that tells us things that we can't always put into words, but it is feedback from when things are right, when things are painful, and all the different in-betweens. So over this year, I'm going through a series of explorations of this work, kind of to get the opportunity to say it out loud, to get people's thoughts, see how much sense it makes to other people. And I'm trying to work towards understanding what education and learning has meant to me, or what I've learned it to become, because it's in this last 15 years that I really started enjoying learning and started really understanding that I learn mostly from people and relationships around me, and the conversations that have been, whether it's in a computer shop or a pub or on the corridor, I realize my head is filled with lots of memories that help me understand the world as a meaningful place. So as a starting point, I looked up the rules and regulations in zoology for zoos and aquaria, and they've come a long way from the 19th century, where they just grabbed poor animals out of places that they've co-evolved with for hundreds of thousands of years and stuck them in an enclosure and gone, right, we just give them some food, right? Well, they couldn't work out why so many species were just dying. And increasingly over time, they realized that it's not about just foods and shelter. It's about, some species have been demonstrated, they need to see other species. They need company. They need relationships. There's a lovely experiment, an accidental discovery they made. Zookeepers were looking at conditioned reflexes and behaviors in ostriches. And these keepers had taken a sack of peanuts into the enclosure. Accidentally it had spilled, and they expected all these ostriches to go, now's our chance, let's go and grab them all. But they suddenly discovered that the ostriches were more interested in the relationship with the keepers. So they demonstrated almost a play behavior. It wasn't just simply about getting food. So this is a quote I took out of the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria. Welfare shall refer to the physical, behavior, and social well-being of animals through the provision of appropriate conditions for the species involved, including but not necessarily limited to housing, environment, diet, veterinary care, and social contact where applicable. And I've put a photograph of a person in prison because it's been deemed by High Court that solitary confinement is a crime against humanity. It so fundamentally damages humans to not have those connections. It damages their mind and their body in measurable ways. And that's why the courts came to that ruling. So it's a critical question for Homo sapiens. And it helped me reading through that evolution of zoology to think more about myself, ourselves, about the cities, about the houses, about the terrains we're living in. What are the ramifications of habitat for ourselves? We're certainly social mammals, and we require all the elements important to the habitat of other species. Social, economic, physiological, ecological, and psychological sources are all involved in constructing our well-being. And there's a term that Harry Burns, who's very involved in healthcare in Scotland, he talks about salutogenesis. What are the causes of health? And it's a distinct study from what are the causes of illness, both, having their place. And some people have said to me, it's wrong to anthropomorphize. So I was looking at Professor Franz de Waal, who's written a lot on animal behavior and consciousness, and he coined the term anthropodenial, saying the question whether anthropomorphism is acceptable or not is inseparable from our relationship with the animal. Whilst it identifies problems with the naive projection of human experience onto other species in attempts to try to understand them, he also acknowledges the basic fundamental fact that we are animals ourselves and share numerous physiological, emotional, and cognitive processes. And I'll add something else in, like growing up, in my family, there was a dog. And she was very much a person to me. And I think I saw lots of wisdom. I think I learned a lot from her. And I think humans have often fallen short of seeing in others what they are aware of in themselves. So I'm really interested in our understanding our habitat and the human alienation from the natural world. What are the conditions we have co-evolved with over hundreds of thousands of years? If we go back 5,000 years, I love this thought. One thing I can share with people who were around then was eating honey and eating. And I'm pretty sure that people would have sat in beautiful places and just been inspired, just felt complete. I was speaking to a guy who was one of the first people who climbed the second highest peak on Everest. It's called Nutse. And when he was asked, why do you climb these mountains? He said, it's a beautiful view. And he thinks that often, to put abstractions onto those experiences is to miss the point. So we're connected with and reflected in the natural world around us. I argue we're increasingly experiencing alienation as a species through damaged and thinned out habitats, devoid or sparse of the basic elements we've co-evolved with over tens of millions of years. With the loss of our natural world, behaviorally, we're experiencing the ill health of alienation from our habitat. So one of the things that they've been doing is looking at the effect of green spaces on our physiology as a sort of really rudimentary measurement. And they've found that being in a living green space lowers our cortisol, the stress hormones that are very tied with a lot of ailments. And over time, we're seeing accelerating changes in our environment, where we're seeing damage to our oceans and deforestation, loss of species, soil erosion, pollution, and climate breakdown. So I'm interested, like, if you all think back to your childhood, what other species do you remember seeing that you don't see now? Seahorses. Wow. Wow. Yeah.
You say red squirrels in Edinburgh. I just don't remember red squirrels in Edinburgh.
Yeah, yeah. I remember the lamps. You always see moths and bugs in the lamps. And on the windscreens of cars, there was always like so much splat. But now you don't see that so much. Hedgehogs, going out as a kid and finding tadpoles and frog spawn, sticklebacks in the burns and stuff. And interestingly, the UK is one of the most deforested places in the world. And I was looking into that and finding some interesting histories from a long time back where they would be cutting down forests just so people couldn't hide in them. So it's really, a very questionable relationship with the environment to cut down in abundance so other people can't have access and privy to them. And the American Psychiatric Association have written about environmental trauma and identified it as a real thing where people have become traumatized, particularly when their grief has not been acknowledged. And there's a researcher called Kevorkian who looked at the impacts of the distress and grief of people who were hearing about orca pods being hunted and stranded and damaged far away from them. And they looked at it in terms of disenfranchised grief. So it's a very important thing to acknowledge what people are feeling. I spoke to somebody who remembers as a child feeling physical pain because the wood nearby her had been cut down because they were laying a new motorway. And she's become an environmentalist and thinker in that area. But that's relatively new, acknowledging these things. So the hindrance of self-reflection, how do I get out of myself as a human, has been a big thing for me. And thinking in the third person and reading about what is important for other species has really helped me get out of my own context, to take on board some of the things that I'm missing, because I don't think I really fully understood the importance of social connections before I read the research of what happens to other species when they're kept in isolation. There's Professor Françoise Wemmelsfelder at Edinburgh University here, who she's done some amazing work and has written about how boredom can be a harm. It can be without meaningful activity. The glucocorticoids, cortisol levels, the adrenaline and stress hormones get so high that it damages both the physiology and the behavior of the animals. And they start to demonstrate often what they coined as abnormal repetitive behaviors. Polar bears pacing back and forth in an enclosure. And then when they've been moved to a larger enclosure, they found that these traumatized polar bears would face exactly the same amount of space as their previous enclosure where they had been traumatized. So the ability to self-reflect is significantly hindered by our gaze inward and seeing everything always through a human lens. So getting beyond the human has been very helpful to me. And increasingly, I'm realizing that the world we live in is governed by finance, and finance is homogenizing our experience. And increasingly, I've been researching the big thinkers that I think really tune into the restrictions that impact on us. So finance shapes our experience, producing a great reduction in what we can and do encounter in the world. For example, the homogenization of the human diet, once composed of a wide variety of plants and animals, is now, for the most, largely composed of processed foods comprised of a small number of species. The Select Committee on Financial Exclusion wrote a report on tackling financial exclusion called Tackling Financial Exclusion, a country that works for everyone, and that's available to read. So how much money you have determines what you can eat and who you can associate with, what fun you can have with others. Like, I remember somebody telling me about how they used to, as a lad, go down and peek over the wall at Tynecastle to watch the football matches. And so many people talked about how football was just financially accessible, whereas now people are saving up just to go to one match. This constitutes a reflection of the diminishment of our sociological and physical habitat. Now, on the right-hand side here, we've got Professor Philip Alston, and he was the special rapporteur on extreme poverty and is one of the most cited human rights scholars in the world. He visited Britain and was asked, so why Britain? By one measure, the sixth richest economy in the world. By another, the 10th richest economy in the world. And he said, well, that is the point. It is a country that has extremities, extreme poverty and extreme wealth. And in this YouTube interview, I'm going to quote from it, poverty could be eliminated in virtually every country if the political elite actually wanted to do that. But they don't. They consciously don't. So looking at the US and the UK, where you've got very wealthy economies, but they still opt to have 15% or whatever of their population living in poverty. And that was really impactful to me. Like the fact that buying McVitie's biscuits made in the UK, you can buy the same biscuits. You can get on a plane and buy the same shopping by going on a plane, going to Belgium, packing your suitcase and coming back on that budget flight and still save £20. But the prices are set so that there are winners and losers. And people at the lowest end of the socioeconomic scale spend around 50% of their income on food. At the upper end, it's about 10%. So this really made me look more at how finance is narrowing opportunity. And Wall Street has been complicit and involved in creating famines. So I'm going to share a few quotes from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. So firstly, the reduction of edible plant species. While there is an estimated 30,000 edible plant species, only 30 crops feed the world, according to the UN. These foodstuffs provide about 95% of dietary calories of protein. Wheat, rice, and maize alone provide more than half of global plant-derived dietary intake. It is these three plants which have received most investment in terms of conservation and improvement. If we add in sorghum, millet, potatoes, and sweet potatoes, soybeans, and sugar, cane, and beet, this brings the total to 75% of the dietary intake. So agriculturally, what's produced and what's available has narrowed more and more and more and more. So physiologically, our habitat has narrowed. And there's a lot of interesting health research now looking at how your gut biome is a reflection of the variety you have in your diet. And the greater variety you have in your diet, the healthier your gut biome, and that is correlated with a number of health outcomes. So our world is one where artificial scarcity is being produced because it's very profitable. And commodities trading on the stock market has shaped access to goods and finance and has been involved in determining what choices people have available to buy them. This is correlated to the socioeconomic phenomena of the artificial inflation of the price of staple foods and the creation of famines. And this was shocking to me. It is shocking. It is frightening. If it hadn't have come from such authoritative sources, I would have struggled to believe it. But this is an article from Harper's. Frederick Kaufman, a professor who studied the food chain, and he wrote The Food Bubble, How Wall Street Starved Millions and Got Away with It. And the United Nations zoomed in on this. And so the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, is a specialized agency of the United Nations which leads international efforts to defeat hunger. In December 2008, they published the book, The State of Food Insecurity in the World, 2008, High Food Prices and Food Insecurity, Threats and Opportunities, in which they identified high food share prices having much to blame for adding 75 million more people to the total number of undernourished in the world. And incidentally, if you're interested, you can go online on the Ragged University website and access all of the references that I'm using in this. So I'll move on to another special rapporteur, Professor Jean Ziegler, who was a special rapporteur for 2 terms running on the right for food at the United Nations. So he quotes FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, indicates further that high food prices of internationally traded commodities, such as staple grains, vegetable oils, are expected to increase the prevalence of malnutrition among both urban and rural households, while noting that the most vulnerable groups are the ones from countries with already low levels of dietary diversity. And this was in 2008, where it was the world's biggest ever wheat harvest. And Professor Kaufman wrote, the wheat harvest of 2008 turned out to be the most bountiful the world has ever seen. So plentiful that even as hundreds of millions slowly starved, 200 million bushels were sold for animal feed. Livestock owners could afford the wheat, but poor people could not. So again, this use of artificially creating scarcity in order to get higher stock prices. I don't know if anybody's interested in computing at the moment, but this is happening with the DRAM, with computer parts. You've got RAM and processors all being bought up by artificial intelligence. And they're now being taken to court because whilst that's all being bought up, the companies have deliberately dropped their production, which is not what you do when you're getting the best ever price you've ever had for your product, but they're throttling it so that they can further inflate the price. And in the United States, they've been identified as a cartel by the courts and are being prosecuted. Hopefully the law will prevail. But this is an idea of how the stock market is shaping our habitat. So returning to Gene Ziegler on system failure, I think he really got upset, and when he finished his second term, he wrote a book called Betting on Famine, where he put all the details in, and he gave several interviews. So there are more and more people who understand that hunger is man-made, that we live in a cannibal world order maintained by multinational companies and their mercenary organizations. That is the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank. So this is a gentleman from the United Nations saying this. In another interview, according to the World Food Organization, there is enough food on the planet for 12 billion people. If people still starve today, it's an organized crime, a mass murder. Every 5 seconds, a child under the age of 10 starves to death, and 1 billion people are permanently, severely malnourished. Why am I talking about this? Well, it's putting into context for me the political decisions not to do healthcare, not to do the things that human societies need. You know, I'm often wondering where our marketplaces are. Like on the continent, and certainly down south, you go to Walthamstow, and particularly London's a rich place for fantastic markets. Everybody gets into a space, and you can go and fill your pantry for a good price. Get good bags of vegetables, and it suits your pocket. Whereas Edinburgh seems to be missing these markets. Again, economics comes from management of the household. And so I don't see it as a terrible and unrealistic thing to think about. There's a quote, and I can't bring the famous person to mind, but I like it. Economics is the study of the ordinary, everyday person in the business of life. So when it's all these bizarre, abstract algorithms that mean nothing to anybody, I think that's poor economics. Crystal ball gazing, and often turns out no better than horoscope predictions. So the financial abstraction of our connection with our world, with our behavior, with each other, with the activities that fill our lives, this impacts on the external world, and it affects all the other species. The financial markets have had the effect of abstracting the owner from the enterprise, homogenizing experience, and reducing diversity in the food chain. And John Maynard Keynes suggested this. One of the big problems he saw was the distance between the owner and the enterprise. So I might think housing's good, great. So I'm going to own some houses, but in New York, but I'm never going to visit there. How do I know that I'm not a slum landlord? How do I know that the people who are giving me money aren't living in damp spaces and having their health very negatively affected because there's black fungus on the wall? Because the factor I've employed doesn't really care. So that's John Maynard Keynes, the distance between the owner and the enterprise. The impact finance has on the food chain is in direct relationship with the large-scale multinational agricultural monocultures, which have wiped out natural biodiversity, direct relationship with the cutting down of rainforests and hedgerows, and the disappearance of smallhold farming, which produce a richer diversity of crops and species. And of course, we've got a picture of the use of pesticides here, which are an awful problem and an under-discussed problem. So these markets are affecting our physical well-being and our psychological well-being, because things like organophosphates don't bode well in our systems. And this is very well researched and very published about. You know, the medical research is clear about these things, but companies like Monsanto are really avoiding moving back towards organic farming techniques that had been around for thousands of years, which are important. We've got farmers in Scotland using glyphosate to desiccate the wheat, meaning dry it out quicker. So they're using a pesticide to dry out their wheat quicker to get it to market quicker. So this I see as very problematic. So returning to other aspects of habitat, those things that contribute to our well-being, our happiness, the erosion of existential and cultural experience. Parallel and intimately linked with the erosion of our physical habitat is the destruction of our existential experience, which for the majority has become diminished through the foregrounding of technology and fast foods, privately owned public spaces, and rents on social experience, and the destruction of meaningful workfulness. Food and eating together illustrates a dynamic relationship of the living experience of a human being in the world. Growing and preparing and sharing foodstuffs puts us in linked relationships with the world. Losing these activities represents loss of that experience and that meaningful activity. And that's really one of the fundamental core behaviors that goes right back to the origins of human societies. And incidentally, the root of the word society is companionship, if you look up the etymology. So I quite like that. And pictures like this are not uncommon in France. Big public spaces, lots of fetes, and people turn out. There's music, there's dancing, there's celebration of life in general. I think this has disappeared from Scotland. I know Scotland best. Scotland's sociological habitat. Even as a kid, I remember many more burn suppers and many more open burn suppers. We've lost about a third of our pub spaces just in the last 10 years. But I always remember on the bar, there would be stovies, a bowl of stovies, and you'd always see the regulars. And they weren't really there to drink. They were there to see the community before they went home, often for their suppers. But we've lost working people's clubs. We've lost even public spaces have been bought up and they have become owned as privately owned public spaces. So I was over at the Omni, spending some time looking at that beautiful woodland on the side of Carlton Hill. And some security guards came out and they said to me, "You've got to move." I said, "Pardon?" They said, "Yeah, you can't be here." "But why?" "This is our property. Our jobs are to keep this clear." I was listening to the bird song. So that really worries me. Financing, structuring the social infrastructure. The same forces have come to act on our social infrastructure in terms of the urban, suburban planning, healthcare, education, safety, and economy. In the same way that finance has structured our landscape, it has come to affect social action and interaction. The activities which people can engage in are determined by the credit rating systems and finances they have available to them. Where historically there were greater numbers of opportunities that people could engage in through personal interaction, trial, and exchange and barter, the growth of technologies and holdings through finance has reduced what is possible without representation through its systems. So that's me trying to crystallize what I'm seeing as a pattern, as a trend in our society. I think we're seeing a loss of sociological habitat. So there's more social isolation and a loss of the things that texture our lives and give us a little bit of delight. And involved in these are the features in the landscape, like the loss of public toilets. Who hasn't shaken a fist? The benches. I noticed up at Surgeons Hall, there's a little square there, and there were always places I could sit on the benches and look at the pigeons. They've removed the benches. This breaks my heart. So the loss of bins and seating, parks and squares and libraries, wild spaces and woodlands also denote a loss of our sociological habitat. Public goods in general, which are important for normal, healthy development, have become prey to financialization processes. The aspects of human existence which public goods provision generally serve human development needs. Human development is being negatively affected by the diminishment of the ecological, the sociological, the geographical, and the economic habitat. And it's causing ailments in us. Loneliness can be very clearly demarcated as related to illness. Financial exclusion, therefore, has its consequences. The Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities for the European Commission published a paper on financial exclusion, detailing the consequences and difficulties caused by the process of financialization, identifying the fact that the use of financial products cannot be avoided in a normal social life, and that in turn, these ultimately shape the lives of people. Financial exclusion can generate further financial consequences by affecting directly or indirectly if and how individuals can raise, assign, and use monetary resources. So a good exercise to do is of a day, of a month, measure how much money you spend when you go out your front door. And I realized it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to go out my door, go about a day without spending money and still have social interaction. And Anne Case and Angus Deaton have written a very interesting book which examines this, Deaths of Despair, and it echoes Emile Durkheim's work on suicide in the 20th century, where he was asking what makes people in France choose voluntary death. And it's powerful, it's very powerful. He speaks about the loss of meaningfulness, anomie, social and psychological impacts of financial exclusion. So these affect patterns of consumption, if and how people are involved in economic activities, access to social welfare. They predetermine the distribution of wealth they encounter in their lifetimes. So Thomas Piketty, an economist who wrote with colleagues biggest economic study in history, kind of shows the pattern of the finance you start out with kind of determines the finance you go through your life with. All of this, it impacts self-esteem, and people can become locked out of their life I was going to say into their life, but for many, it's not a life. Even going out for a coffee, it's so meaningful. So defining social exclusion is really very important, and there's some great work being done on it. Social exclusion is a complex and multidimensional process. It involves a lack or denial of resources, rights, goods, and services, and the inability to participate in normal relationships and activities available to the majority of people in society, whether in economic, social, cultural, or political arenas. It affects both the quality of life of individuals and the equity and cohesion of society as a whole. A shorthand term for what can happen when people or areas suffer from a combination of linked problems such as unemployment, poor skills, low incomes, poor housing, high crime environments, bad health, and family breakdown. So for a long time, I lived on an estate next to the Pentlands called Oxgangs in the high flats. And this guy from a company, he said, I want you to install these machines around your community. You can then do a local enterprise token scheme. I had to say, I'm sorry, there's nowhere to install them. There's a chippy, there's a bookie, there's a pub, and the corner shop, but there is nowhere. So it was, I don't live there anymore, but it was a very denuded landscape. So my conclusion is the impoverishment of the habitat. Ultimately, the effects of social exclusion impacts on health and welfare, whether that relates to what happens through social exclusion or physical harms such as we see in malnutrition or disease. And we do see malnutrition in Britain. It has impacted particularly communities who need to shop in pound shops. Financial exclusion results in social exclusion, which can be understood as an impoverishment of habitat, both social and physical. I'd love to take the offer of going skiing in Aspen, but I ain't got no skis and I can't get there. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I would love your thoughts and help me think critically about what I've said and what I've missed.